Welcome back to the Knit Yorker podcast. My name is Magali, and here we talk about all things knitting and crafty. I've been knitting for almost 10 years now, and I think I've learned a lot during that time, not just from watching tutorials and from, learning techniques, but also just from doing it and from making mistakes and from the experience of knitting different types of projects. And I have had a lot of people ask me in the past, friends especially, that want to get into knitting, if there's anything that they should know before they start, if there are like any tips that I could give them, anything that would help them ease into it, more than just the learning the motions or the very basic things. And yes, I do actually. I do have a lot of things that I wish I had known when I started. And I probably would have learned some of this if I had had a teacher, but I was self-taught. So I had to learn a lot of these things on my own. And I thought, instead of just talking to you today about those things, I wanted to invite my audience and people who, watch my videos or follow me on Instagram to share their knowledge, to share what are some things that they wish they knew before they had started to knit. And before I get into that, let's quickly talk about what I'm actually knitting at the moment. I'm working on a summer top. This is the adult cotton candy tee by Needles and Life, who is my friend Kaylee, who made this pattern. I actually tested this one, the kid version. I tested one of these and I made it for my niece because it was for kid version and she loved it. And not only did she love it, but my mom loved it too. And she was like, I want one. So then later, Kaylee released an adult version. And so that's what I'm making right now. I'm knitting it for my mom. So far, it just looks like a regular tee. And it's pretty quick to knit too. But it has a really nice ruffle at the end. I'm getting close to that. And also, it has like nice, you can add long sleeve or ruffle sleeve or a cap sleeve. I think I'm gonna do a cap sleeve just because that's all I have enough yarn for. I'm working with We Are Knitters the cotton, which is what I've made this exact same pattern with before, and honestly it's one of my favorite cotton yarns out there, so I do go back to that one a lot. So that's what I'm using, and the color is rust, I think, dark rust. So yeah, that's what I'm currently knitting. If you're watching this though, you're probably interested on the tips, right? Because I'm assuming if you clicked on this video, you're probably either a beginner or someone who has experience, but maybe not as much experience and would like to learn more tips before getting deeper into knitting. Or maybe you're a very experienced knitter and you want to hear what I'm talking about, and if you can add on to it, and please do in the comments. So what I'm gonna do is talk about the things that I wish that I knew before I started knitting. And I'm going to divide them in basically 3 categories. We're going to talk about just in general things that would be helpful to have known, more technical things that some people shared, and then of course yarn, because yarn has its own category, y'all. Starting with kind of like the general category and things that generally would be helpful to have known as a beginner. I wish I would have known how much I would enjoy it so that I could have started sooner. I tried crochet a few times and it never clicked, but knitting did. This is such a sweet one, and I agree, because I too have the experience when I was growing up. I wanted to learn to knit. It was something that caught my eye and I was interested maybe when I was like 10 or 11. There was no one in my life that could teach me, basically, and no classes that I could take. I don't know. It just seemed so daunting, and I didn't learn. And then later in life, I still was interested, but it just seemed like such a difficult thing, and I was a little bit like, oh, I'm not gonna be good at this. This looks too complicated. Can't really like understand how it works. So I was a little bit thrown aback by it. So when one time finally I decided to just look at tutorials and try it on my own, I realized it wasn't as scary, and it was actually really something that I really enjoyed, and obviously that I got really into because I've been doing it for nonstop for the past almost 10 years. And just like this comment, I really wish that I had learned back when I was a 6th grader, 12, 11-year-old, and I would have had so much more knowledge by now. I would have made so many other things. And I think, you can learn pretty young. I've seen 8-year-olds, 7-year-olds learning, and they get it pretty quickly. It's not actually that scary. So if you're in that boat, if you're like, I want to try it, maybe you do other things, you do crochet or other things. And a lot of people say this to me, like, oh, it looks so hard. And it's like, yeah, it might look hard. And there are things about it that are complicated, but the very basic techniques of knitting and purling, I think anyone can learn. So if you're on the fence, I'm telling you, it's worth it. You can do it. And I did it on my own. You can do it too. So continuing on the general ideas or general things that would be helpful to have known, it says, yarn brands are not a reliable good source of knitting patterns. Some are just so poorly written. And I think it depends on the brand. I have had good and bad experiences with finding knitting patterns that way. And I think the ultimate problem with this is that when you're starting to knit and maybe you get beyond the basic, squares and dishcloths and scarves, and you want to try something a little more challenging, and you start to learn to read knitting patterns, maybe you do not know where you can find them or where you should even look for them. And maybe you'll go to places like Pinterest or just Googling like knitting patterns. And a lot of the things you're going to get are from brands, from yarn brands usually. And a lot of brands create really good knitting patterns. I have had good experience with Knit Picks, with Hobby Yarn, with Pearl Soho. And it's because those specific brands, I already know that they hire designers, and sometimes very experienced ones, very famous ones too. They do collaborations with them, or they have designers on staff that all they do is create patterns with their yarn. And of course they're promoting their yarn, and usually those types of patterns are pretty good. But there are other brands out there who maybe are not as good. Like, for example, I would not really trust the knitting patterns that you find on the back of the labels of some yarn. I haven't really tried them as much, but they're usually they don't have a lot of details. I have bad luck with other brands that you would think that they would have designers like the ones I mentioned, but they don't. And I don't want to say it, but I might put it on the screen. But I had an experience once of buying a kit from a company, and they, a kit that came with the yarn and with the pattern, and the pattern was terribly written. I could not understand it. It didn't make any sense. The math was wrong, and so it was driving me crazy, and I ended up using the yarn for something completely different because it just didn't work. Not in the back of a yarn label or on a website of a brand. Where do you find knitting patterns? Well, if you have not heard of this resource, it's going to change your life. And it's called Ravelry. So Ravelry, it's just a website for, you could call it kind of like social media for yarn related things. I don't think that it's quite social media, even though it has a social part to it. But basically it's a resource with lots of information on patterns, yarn, designers. Like a lot of designers, including me, post their patterns there. And the nice thing about it that you won't find in other places, like in Pinterest or even on Etsy, is that people are able to kind of, if they're working on a pattern, they're able to put it like in their own projects and like link to it. So if they have any not just comments, but as they're making the project, they can put notes, they can ask questions, and you can see all of this information on the pattern page. I found a lot of patterns that way that I really like, and then I read some of the comments of like, no, actually this pattern was not working for me, and it was really badly written, or it doesn't have all the sizes that I need, or etc. etc. So not only are you able to find a database, probably one of the most full of the internet of patterns of all kinds that you can filter through, but also it has that like aspect of people reviewing and writing notes and comments about the patterns. So my recommendation is try Ravelry instead of relying on things like brands. But yeah, that was an interesting one, and I agree that it doesn't always work. But I have found some yarn brands that do have really good patterns. So I wouldn't say that this applies to everyone, but I recommend going into Ravelry and reading a little bit about the pattern before you actually start the pattern. Another general tip I would give to a beginner, my own, would be to really, really start small. I know I'm going to be talking about patterns and yarn and techniques and all these things, and it's good to know them. But I think the most important thing, and something that it's sometimes hard to do when you are excited and you want to try all these things, or maybe there's some pattern you really want to do it, but you've never knitted anything before. I'm not saying you can't, but it's definitely gonna take you too much more than it would have if you already had the knowledge, and it's going to be a rockier road, I would say. And not that that's a bad thing, but it might get you discouraged. And I always say to anyone who wants to learn, just start simple, start small. Walk before you run, basically. You don't want to run a marathon just after you learn to walk. So with that in mind, that doesn't mean that you have to do something boring. There's a lot of fun little projects you can do. For example, you could do dish clothes. You could do squares and do dish clothes. But if you're not really into that, you can still knit squares and then sew them together, and now you have a blanket. Yeah, I would really say I wish I had done that, because I definitely tried too much too fast. And it did get me a little bit frustrated, and I actually had to take a step back and be like, okay, maybe I need to start with something simpler instead of trying to make this thing that I can barely understand the knitting pattern at the moment, and it's driving me crazy. I would also say that it's very important that you remember that the thing about knitting is that you can always go back. You can always undo it. You can always start over. And, there's no losing in knitting, basically. I've made entire projects and then unraveled the entirety of it and started over and made something completely different with that same yarn more than once. That's happened before. And that's totally fine. That is the beauty of knitting. It gives you all this power of being able to start over and hopefully not feel bad about it. It's hard not to feel bad about failing or not doing something the way that you wanted it to, or not, finishing it. But I think that's not really the point. The point is that you enjoy the process and then you end up with something that you like. So if either of those things are not working out, feel totally free to just start over. And that's one of the most important things that I had to learn over time, that it doesn't have to be perfect on the first try. It's totally fine to make mistakes. One of the comments that I got actually touched on this, which was that you really do learn from every mistake you make, and that you can always start again, and that's okay. And that's a summary of everything I said earlier, and I totally agree. That's one of the most beautiful things about knitting that you can learn, and that I am grateful every day for having learned that lesson. And it might be harder at first to learn that lesson, but be aware of it, and it might make things easier. Let's talk about yarn now, and then our next category of tips and things I wish I'd known. Not all yarn is the same. That's the biggest thing I had to learn. And I think one of the other things is what I'm going to read a couple of, because a lot of people had the same idea. One thing I wish I knew is that yarn buying would also become a separate, incredibly expensive hobby. How much yarn costs. The price of good and environmentally friendly yarn is insane. I have a whole video about knitting misconceptions, and I have a whole section about how people really think that knitting something is cheaper than buying it. People in general. And sometimes I honestly used to think that too. In reality, yarn is not the cheapest thing. Even if you go to a craft store and buy acrylic yarn, the most inexpensive one, it's still gonna be at least $5 for a skein. And depending on what you're making, if you're making a blanket or a sweater or anything, even a scarf, you're gonna need more than one. It adds up really quickly. And then if you start to get into nicer yarn, like one of these comments mentions environmentally friendly yarn, which could be, yarn that it's not superwash, or that it's not acrylic, or that, it's made in a ethical way, environmentally friendly, etc. Of course, that's gonna be more expensive, as anything with that kind of value is. I wasn't prepared for the actual cost of yarns. I remember walking into my first yarn store and being like shocked by how much yarn costed, and like really thinking that it wasn't worth me buying that kind of yarn because I didn't really know how to knit more than just like very simple things at the time. So it was a little overwhelming, and it still honestly is. Like to this day, I go to some, yarn stores in person and I feel overwhelmed by the amount of things and how much they cost, and like not wanting to spend my entire budget on yarn, which is hard. The other thing it was mentioned here, buying yarn can be its own hobby. Like there's so many dyers, indie dyers, there's so many brands, so many different kinds, from so many different places, combinations, and so much of it is so beautiful, and especially when you're in person and you're like touching it and looking at it, and it's hard not to just go off the rails and spend hundreds of dollars in beautiful yarn, and then it sits somewhere in your living room, in your studio, whatever, closet, and doesn't get used. And that personally bothers me. I don't like having yarn that I don't use, having a stash. A lot of people enjoy that, and that's fine as long as you're prepared mentally to know that a lot of money is gonna go into that yarn. Again, that doesn't mean that you have to spend all that money or that you can't knit or be part of the knitting or crochet community if you don't have all the money to spend. Like I said, there are a lot of options. One of my favorite ones, and that I always want to bring up, is sourcing your yarn from other places that might not be as obvious. So that means like buying secondhand yarn, for example. That could be from online, but like places, even Poshmark and Mercari and all those like online places where you usually buy like clothes and other type of stuff. People sometimes sell their yarn there. On Ravelry, people sell their yarn. On Instagram, people do these stashes where, they bought a lot of yarn and now they're not really going to use it anymore. So they sell it, and it tends to be cheaper than the retail price because people, they're trying to get rid of it. And I have been giving yarn also by friends, people. You can go to state sales if someone was a knitter. You can go to thrift stores. Of course, it's going to be more of a hunt, and you might not get that specific dyer or specific color or a specific amount or specific kind. So it's definitely a different adventure. But all this to say that it doesn't mean that knitting is unattainable for most people, but you gotta be aware that it can become an expensive hobby if you let it get away and if you don't watch yourself. So again, not a bad thing, and I'm all for people spending their money where they love to spend it, but I think more than anything, just be aware that yarn is not cheap. Another yarn related one that I got is something that they wish they'd known before they started knitting, is how much space I would need if I didn't stop buying yarn. So one problem is the expense of yarn, but if you're okay with that, then it becomes a problem of like physicality. Where do you keep all this yarn? Yarn takes up space. Just like with other things, like people who love reading and buying books, with yarn, you can buy yarn much faster than you can knit it, for sure. So that means that very easily you can end up with a lot of yarn and not a lot of places to put it in. And also you want to be kind of careful how you store it, because you don't want it to get moldy or dirty, or worst case scenario, moths. We wouldn't want that, right? So of course you have to figure out how to store it depending on how you live and where you live. In my case, I live in an apartment in a city. I don't have a lot of space to keep my yarn, and therefore I try to keep my stash very small, and I've made videos where I talk about my stash before. So that's definitely something that you might want to think about before you start acquiring all of this yarn. Definitely a good tip. Something that I myself would give as a recommendation, or something that I wish I had known, is that not all yarn is the same. And I said at the beginning of this part that, there's all these different kinds of yarn, and it can be overwhelming. Like, what's the difference between wool and alpaca and acrylic? And why are all these different weights? What is fingering, and then what bulky, and what's the difference, and what needle do I use? That can be overwhelming. It can be. My personal way of recommending handling that is to kind of go one at a time, like instead of, if you're just starting out and you're like, I want to buy all the yarn and I'm really into this and I'm going to learn and all these things, and then you go and you buy a bunch of yarn. The reality is that a lot of this yarn that you get at the beginning, because you don't have the knowledge yet, is not going to be very useful to you. Like you won't know what a sweater quantity is, or how much yarn you should be getting in order to make something, or what kind of yarn is better, for example, for knitting socks versus knitting a sweater versus knitting color work, and all these different things. So that is something that the only way of learning is, well, A, watching videos that help you out, but B, actually using it. So my biggest recommendation is to, even if you are all ready to knit and you don't mind spending all the money in yarn, I would still say to slow down and to try not to buy a lot at the beginning, and try to buy for the specific project that you have, and kind of like experiment as you go with any new project. Try different yarn, try different weights, try different brands, and give yourself time to get to know the yarn itself, get to see how it works and what you like better. And then you'll find that there are certain types of yarn that you prefer to work with. Later on, if you realize that that's not really the yarn that you want to use, then you're stuck with this, and that's why you end up giving it away or selling it, or not using it and just taking up space. So that's something I really wish I known, because I definitely bought a lot of acrylic and craft yarn that at the moment I don't really use in my projects. Not that there's anything wrong with that yarn, it's just that I prefer to do other types of projects. I like to use wool better. I like, certain brands now that I've used before and that I know that I like. Yeah, that's one of the biggest yarn tips that I would give to a beginner. And I actually, there's a really similar sentiment in one of the comments that I got that says, I wish I wouldn't have bought so much cheap acrylic yarn when I was a brand new knitter, but I kind of went yarn crazy. Now I have all these yarns sitting here because I don't want to make anything with it, and I pretty much exclusively use wool or cotton these days. I think it's better to invest in a smaller amount of good quality yarn than just buying as much cheaper yarn as possible, for me at least. So that goes with the same idea of like, yarn is not cheap, but the yarn that costs more, some of it, might be something that you're worth investing on. So maybe think that instead of, going and buying 10 different skeins of yarn for cheap at the craft store that you don't really know what you would do with, but hey, I'm starting this new hobby, why not buy all this? And then later realizing like, hey, actually I would have preferred to spend that money in 2 skeins of this certain yarn that I really, really like, and that is a different quality, and that would give me a different result, and maybe I would only make one project with it, but it would be more valuable to me. So yeah, it will take time to get there, and I totally invite you to experiment as a new knitter, but I agree that going yarn crazy at the beginning is not a good idea. just try it again, starting small and then growing into knowing what is the yarn that you like to work with. Now for the more technical category of things that I wish I had known and tips. There might be things about this that you don't really understand if you're a really, really beginner, but maybe it's good that you hear it, even if you're not quite there yet, just so that, because it'll come back and you'll be like, that's the thing. So I do recommend still watching, even if it gets a little too technical. But one of the comments that I got is one of the most important things that you can learn as a beginner. So I'm going to read it to you. It says, I wish I had known how important it is swatching to get correct gauge, but not just a little 4x4 square swatch, but a proper in the round that you can undo and restart. Young knitter ones, you will learn a lot from your mistakes. There's no shortcuts. Experiment until you have a good understanding of your tension and how to adapt for perfect sizing. So tension is one of the most important, and like maybe getting you to the advanced or more, knowledgeable knitter knowledge that you can do. It will allow you to basically knit anything you want, including garments. Is something that I don't recommend anyone who doesn't really understand what the tension is, or what a gauge swatch is, or what it's for, before knitting a sweater at the very least. Like, you can knit blankets, you can knit scarves and things that it doesn't really matter exactly what size they look like. But as soon as you get into garments, especially sweaters, you're going to run into the issue of attention. So I'm not going to go too into detail because I feel like that requires a whole other video. But what this person is saying is that you got to learn to swatch and to achieve gauge. And it can be, even if you know what it is, a lot of knitters don't want to do it because when you're casting something on a new project, you're so excited. You just want to dive into it. You just want to start knitting it. But you got to take a step back and make sure that you make a swatch so that your tension matches the tension in the pattern, so that after you do all the work, the pattern, the project actually fits you. So that is the big lesson here. And like this person mentions, sometimes that means knitting a swatch in the round, and that means a little more work. And sometimes it means blocking the swatch. So like just all this extra work to just get started can be a little frustrating, but doing that work will save you from frogging an entire project at the end because it doesn't fit you. And you will be way ahead of yourself once you get that right and understand how to do it. And I think, like I said, I will make a whole video about this because it really is so specific and technical, but very, very important. Still on the technical-ish part of the advice, someone said, top-down knitting, nothing else will do. So this one is more of like a personal opinion type of thing, because I did say, what would you wish you had known yourself as a knitter? Top-down knitting basically means that you are knitting starting at the top of whatever the garment is or whatever the project is. This top is top-down because I started at the top at the collar and then I'm knitting down. One of the reasons that a lot of knitters prefer patterns that are written this way is because it allows them to try things on as they go. So if they need to make them a little longer, a little shorter, or whatever, it's doable. It also, if you're knitting something with color work or something that has, fun stuff at the top, you get onto that first. So it's people are excited to knit that, so of course they want that. Another big reason is because sweaters, especially, or tops, when they're knit top down, that means there's a lot less sewing involved, a lot less picking up things. It's almost like knitting something in one single piece rather than a lot of different pieces and then putting them together. So it is definitely a personal preference thing, but it does become faster sometimes to knit top down, and a lot of people prefer it. I personally have no special preference of knitting. I do kind of get annoyed sometimes when I have to knit things in pieces and sew them together. A lot of vintage patterns, in fact, basically every vintage pattern you see will be knit in panels. And so instead of knitting like one whole piece, you would have a front panel and a back panel, or if it's a cardigan, like two front panels, and then you sew them together. So that definitely takes more time, but it gives a different structure. And some patterns, for some type of things, you just have to do it. There's no other way. But yeah, that's a personal opinion thing, but it's good to be aware, because when you look at patterns, you will see that the construction is top down, and so you know what that means. You know that means you're gonna knit it all in one piece, probably mostly in one piece, and you're gonna start at the collar or whatever the top of the pattern is rather than at the bottom. And so I guess my final advice that kind of would be technical or in general is that you don't need to know everything. That is my biggest thing. You don't need to learn every single thing about knitting. You don't need to learn every stitch even. You don't even need to learn by heart the pattern that you're knitting, because there's so many resources out there. There's so many videos, knit alongs, there's so much community too, that if you have a question, very likely somebody will help you out. I would say knitting is, it's almost like communal knowledge, and there will always be techniques and there will always be things that you never learned how to do or that you didn't know about. Like, I didn't know you could cast on that way or cast off that way or do it that way. And there's never like a right answer on how to do things. There's many ways of even knitting itself. There's continental knitting, there's English style knitting, and so many other styles, and it doesn't make it better than each other. It's just a different way of doing things. So don't feel bad if you are a little bit overwhelmed by all the information and all the different things and you don't really get them yet, because nobody really does, I don't think. Even the people that have been knitting for their whole lives, 50 years, and they're like expert knitters, I'm sure that there's a technique or something that they've never tried and that they've never learned. And there's always something new to learn. And that's the exciting part, that there's always new things to try, new patterns out there. There's always something to do. So it just keeps it exciting, I think, and never bored. That's all of my things that I wish I had known before I started knitting, and that I guess that I know them now are the reason why I'm still knitting today. I hope that it was helpful for you, or that if you are also somebody who has been knitting for a while, if you have your own advice or thoughts or comments or anything that you want to share and then you want to help out somebody who's starting out, please do so in the comments. I hope that just keeps growing the community, and that somebody who might feel a little beginner and a little lost might find their place because of you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you stay in my channel, subscribe, watch some other videos that I have. I have tutorials, I have videos for beginners, videos for more experienced knitters, a lot of vintage knitting and also vintage sewing. So there's a lot of fun stuff out there in my channel. I hope you enjoy it and that you enjoyed this video. And you can also watch some of my other podcasts in which I usually touch on things that people share with me in the comments and in the videos. Look out for more questions for a future podcast, and happy knitting!